Welcome to Creepypasta Delight. Tonight we delve into the legend of the Skinwalker, a creature of Navajo lore said to stalk the night in stolen forms. These stories will have you questioning who or what you can trust. Want even more unsettling stories? For just $5 a month, unlock bonus episodes and chilling stories too terrifying for the main show. Turn off the lights, double check the locks, and let's begin. This is Creepypasta Delight, and tonight we face the Skinwalker. I don't normally pick up hitchhikers, not out here. The highway I was on cut through miles of barren desert, with nothing but sand, cracked asphalt, and the occasional tumbleweed to keep me company. It was the kind of emptiness that made you feel like the last person alive. The hitchhiker appeared just before sunset. I spotted him standing on the shoulder about 50 feet ahead, his arm outstretched with his thumb up. His face was obscured by the brim of a wide hat, and he was wearing a loose-fitting flannel shirt. Something about him made me uneasy. I slowed down, almost out of instinct, but then I remembered the stories my dad used to tell me about people disappearing on roads like this. He always said, you don't stop for anyone out there. Sometimes it's not people asking for help. I pressed my foot to the gas and sped past him, but as I glanced in the rearview mirror, I swear I saw his head snap up, like he knew I was watching him. I stopped at a gas station about 10 miles down the road. It was one of those old, beat-up places with a flickering neon sign and a single rusted pump. I stepped out to stretch my legs and grab a soda, but as I walked toward the door, my stomach dropped. That hitchhiker was sitting on the bench outside the station. His hat was pulled low, but I could see just enough of his face to recognize the sharp angle of his jaw and the flannel shirt he was wearing. "Evening," he said. I froze. My mind raced. There was no way he could have gotten here before me. I didn't see any cars pass me on the road, and there were no turnoffs for miles. Evening," I mumbled and ducked into the store. The cashier was an older guy with leathery skin who barely looked up from his newspaper when I walked in. "Hey," I said, keeping my voice low. "Did you see that guy outside? How'd he get here?" The cashier raised an eyebrow. "What guy?" I turned to point toward the window, but when I looked out, that bench was empty. I should have just left at that moment, driven off, never even looked back. But I didn't. When I got back in my car, I couldn't stop thinking about it, about him, about how wrong it all felt. I told myself I had imagined it, that maybe it was just someone who looked similar. I was about 20 minutes down the highway when I saw him again. This time, he was standing in the middle of the road. I slammed on the brakes, my tires screeching as I came to a stop just a few feet away from him. My heart was pounding in my chest as I stared at him through the windshield. He didn't move. He just stood there, staring back at me, his face still partially hidden by that damn hat. I rolled down the window just enough to shout, "What the hell is your problem?" "Car broke down up the road," he said, his voice too calm for the situation. "Need a ride?" I didn't want to let him in. Every instinct I had was screaming at me to drive away. But then he looked up, and for the first time, I saw his eyes. They were wrong. Too wide. Too dark. "I'll pay you," he added, pulling a crumpled bill from his pocket. "Fine," I said through gritted teeth. He sat quietly in the passenger seat for the first few minutes, just staring out the window. I kept my eyes on the road, gripping the wheel so tightly my knuckles turned white. "So," he said finally, "where you headed?" "Doesn't matter," I muttered. He chuckled. It was low and gravelly, like he hadn't used his voice in years. "You live out here?" he asked after a long pause. "Pretty desolate place to call home." "No," I said a little sharper than I intended. "Just passing through." He nodded, but didn't say anything else. After a while, I noticed him humming softly. At first, I thought it was just some random tune, but then I froze. He was humming my voice. I don't know how else to describe it. The pitch, the rhythm. It was like I was listening to a recording of myself. "Can you stop that?" I snapped. "Sorry," he said, but his lips curled into a small smile. We drove in silence after that. I kept sneaking glances at him out of the corner of my eye, but he just stared out the window like he didn't have a care in the world. Finally, I couldn't take it anymore. "What would you do?" he said suddenly, "if you saw yourself on the side of the road?" I blinked. "What?" "You're driving down this empty highway," he said, his voice calm and casual, "and you see someone standing on the shoulder. Someone who looks exactly like you. Same face, same clothes. What do you do?" I didn't answer. My heart was pounding in my chest. "Would you stop?" he asked. I gritted my teeth. "You need to get out of my car." He turned to look at me, and for the first time, I saw his face clearly. It was my face. Every detail was perfect. The curve of my nose, the scar on my chin, even the faint stubble on my jaw. But his smile, that wasn't mine. I slammed on the brakes, and the car skidded to a stop. "Get out!" He didn't move. Finally, he opened the door and stepped out. He stood there on the side of the road, watching as I sped away, my heart hammering in my chest. It wasn't until I stopped at another gas station an hour later that I realized something was wrong. The cashier looked up as I walked in, his eyes narrowing. "Didn't you just come through here?" he asked. "No," I said, but as I turned to look out the window, I saw my car still parked at the pump, and in the driver's seat was me. I was 13 when I broke my family's most sacred rule: never go outside at night. It wasn't superstition. My grandmother always said it was a sharpness that cut through her normally soft voice. She'd tell us stories about creatures that mimicked voices to trick you, creatures that weren't quite human but could pretend well enough to fool you, and creatures that could steal your skin if you weren't careful. But when you're 13, it's hard to take stories like that seriously. It's easy to laugh them off, to roll your eyes when your grandmother insists that a coyote's calling your name. But when you're 13, it's hard to take stories like that seriously. It's easy to laugh them off, to roll your eyes when your grandmother insists that a coyote calling your name isn't a coyote at all. That's what I thought, until the night I heard my mother's voice calling me from the edge of the woods. It was late, probably past midnight, and I was lying awake in my bed, scrolling on my phone. The only light in the room came from the dim glow of the screen. My younger brother, Ryan, was asleep in the bunk below, snoring softly. The night was quiet, except for the faint sound of crickets and the occasional rustle of wind outside. It was the kind of peaceful silence that always lulled me to sleep. Then I heard it. "Sarah," a voice called softly. I froze. It was my mom's voice, but something about it sounded off, like she was too far away, her words stretched and distorted by the night. The voice came again. "Sarah." I sat up and peered out the window. The moonlight illuminated the edge of the woods about 50 yards from my house. There was no one there, just the faint outline of trees swaying in the breeze. The logical part of me knew it couldn't be her. My mom was asleep in her room down the hall. But another part of me, stubborn, rebellious, stupid, wanted to check. "Sarah, come here," the voice said again, insistent now. Against my better judgment, I slipped out of bed, careful not to wake Ryan. The floorboards creaked under my feet as I tiptoed out of the room. I stepped outside in the cool night air. The sky was clear, the stars scattered across a deep black expanse. The woods loomed ahead of me, their shadows shifting in the pale moonlight. "Mom?" I called out softly. "Sarah, over here," the voice answered, deeper into the trees. I hesitated. It was darker near the woods, the trees so thick that moonlight barely reached the ground. The crickets had stopped chirping, and the wind had gone still. Something about the silence felt wrong. I took a step forward, then another. My heart was pounding in my chest as I approached the edge of the woods. That's when I noticed the tracks. They were faint, almost hidden in the dirt, but they didn't look human. They were too wide, too long, with claws that dug deep into the earth. But the farther they went, the more they changed. By the time they reached the trees, they looked just like human footprints. "Sarah," the voice called again. But this time, it didn't sound like my mom. It sounded like me. I turned to run, but I didn't make it far. Something moved in the shadows, faster than my eyes could follow. One moment I was sprinting towards the house. In the next, I was on the ground gasping for air. I didn't see what knocked me down, but I could feel it. Something heavy and cold pinning me to the dirt. I clawed at the ground trying to pull myself free, but it was too strong. Then I heard it. the sound of my own voice whispering in my ear. You shouldn't have come outside. I screamed and thrashed, kicking at whatever was holding me. My foot connected with something solid, and suddenly the weight was gone. I scrambled to my feet and bolted for the house, not daring to look back. When I reached the front door, I slammed it shut behind me and locked it. My chest was heaving, my legs trembling as I leaned against the door. Sarah? I turned and my mom was standing in the hallway, her face etched with confusion and concern. Where were you? She asked. I heard you, I stammered. Her face went pale. You went outside? Before I could answer, she grabbed my arm and dragged me into the living room. My grandmother was already there, sitting in her usual chair with a blanket draped over her lap. Her eyes widened when she saw me. You broke the rule, she said, her voice low and trembling. I'm sorry, I said, tears welling up in my eyes. I didn't... Did it touch you? She interrupted. I hesitated. Yes, I admitted. Her expression darkened. Then it has your scent now. It will follow you. That night, my mom and grandmother stayed up, burning sage and sprinkling ash around the house. They muttered prayers under their breath, their voices barely audible over the crackling fire in the hearth. I stayed in my room, curled up on the top bunk, staring at the window. I didn't sleep. At some point, I must have dozed off, because when I opened my eyes, the first rays of sunlight were streaming through the curtains. I let out a shaky breath and climbed out of bed, feeling a wave of relief washing over me. Maybe it was over. Maybe the prayers had worked. But when I went into the kitchen, my mom and grandmother were nowhere to be found. Mom? I called out. No answer. Grandma? Silence. I checked every room in the house, but they were gone. That's when I heard it. My own voice calling from the woods. Sarah, come outside. When Thomas went missing, we all felt responsible. There were 6 of us in the search party, volunteers from the small mountain town of Reddington. People go missing in these woods more often than they should, but usually it's hikers or tourists who get careless on the trails, not locals. Thomas, though, he was one of us. He'd grown up here, knew every trail, every shortcut, every hidden danger. So when we heard he'd vanished, we didn't hesitate to look for him. None of us said it aloud, but we all felt it. If someone like Thomas could disappear, what hope did the rest of us have? The trail he had taken was one most people avoided. It ran through an old part of the forest, where the trees grew so close together the sunlight barely reached the ground. Locals called it the Devil's Spine. Thomas's last call came from somewhere near there. He told a friend he was camping by himself and heard strange howls in the night. By the time anyone reached his campsite, it was empty. His gear was still there, but Thomas was gone. When we found the site, it didn't make sense. The fire pit had been doused, but was still warm. His tent was zipped shut, his pack untouched. But the dirt around the campfire told a different story. Deep clawed gouges in the earth, and a faint set of tracks leading into the woods. Bear? Someone suggested, but the tracks didn't look like bear prints. They didn't look like anything. We were 3 hours into the search when things started feeling off. The forest was too quiet. Normally you'd hear birds, insects, maybe the occasional rustle of leaves, but there was nothing. Just the crunch of our boots on the dry underbrush. I was walking near Jessie, one of the younger volunteers, when she pointed at a tree. Look, she said, her voice trembling. I followed her gaze and saw the claw marks, deep, jagged lines carved into the bark, too far apart to belong to any animal I'd ever seen. They go up, Jessie whispered. She was right. The claw marks didn't stop at the trunk. They continued up the tree, vanishing into the thick canopy up above. That's when we started hearing the howls. It started as a low, distant wail, almost like the wind, but the longer it went on, the clearer it became. It wasn't the wind. It wasn't an animal. It was something else. Something that sounded almost human. By the time we set up camp for the night, the howls had stopped, but the unease lingered. No one talked much as we built a fire and sat around it, sipping coffee from the thermoses and pretending we weren't scared. Then we noticed the stranger. By the time we set up camp for the night, the howls had stopped, but the unease lingered. No one talked much as we built a fire and sat around it, sipping coffee from the thermoses and pretending we weren't scared. Then we noticed the stranger. He was sitting just outside the circle of firelight, his face obscured by the shadows. "Who the hell are you?" one of the guys Nate demanded, standing up. The stranger didn't move. "Got lost," he said, his voice low and hoarse. "Saw your fire." "Lost?" Nate repeated. "Where the hell did you come from?" The stranger didn't answer. He just sat there, hunched over, staring into the flames. Something about him set me on edge. Maybe it was the way he wouldn't look directly at anyone, or the fact we hadn't heard him approach. "What's your name?" Jessie asked, her voice soft. The stranger lifted his head, just enough for the firelight to catch his face. It was pale, almost waxy, with deep hollows under his eyes. "Thomas," he said. My blood ran cold. "Thomas is the guy we're looking for," Nate said, glaring at him. "So try again." The stranger tilted his head, as if confused. "I'm Thomas," he repeated. That's when we heard it. A rustling sound coming from the darkness beyond the firelight. "What the hell was that?" Jessie whispered, clutching her flashlight. Before anyone could answer, the stranger stood up. He was tall, too tall, his limbs gangly and bent at odd angles. "I'll check it out," he said, his voice now imitation of Nate's. He disappeared into the trees before anyone could stop him. We didn't sleep much after that. The stranger never came back, but the noises didn't stop. Twigs snapping, leaves crunching, soft whispers carried on the wind. At some point, Nate tried to laugh it off, saying, "It's probably just some asshole messing with us." But his voice was shaky. Around 3 a.m., Jessie swore she heard someone calling her name from the woods. By the time the sun came up, one of us was gone. Jessie. Her sleeping bag was empty, her flashlight lying abandoned on the ground. There were no tracks leading away from the campsite. It was as if she had just vanished. But when we looked around, we noticed something strange. There were more footprints in the dirt than there should have been. We didn't talk much as we packed up camp. Jessie's disappearance had us all on edge, but there was no sign of her. Not a single track, not even a broken twig to show which direction she had gone. It didn't make any sense. The 6 of us had turned into 5 overnight, and every one of us knew it could have been worse. Nate tried to play leader, saying we should stick together and head back to town, but nobody wanted to admit the truth. Jessie wasn't the first person to disappear in these woods, and she would not be the last. It was on the hike back that the paranoia set in. The trail twisted through dense trees, the sun barely filtering through the canopy. Every so often, we'd stop to catch our breath and take a head count. 5 of us. Always 5. But it was getting harder to remember who had been standing next to me a moment ago. At one point, Nate pulled me aside. "Did you notice anything weird about Carter?" he asked, keeping his voice low. I glanced at Carter, who was up ahead, carrying the map. He was a quiet guy, one of Jessie's friends, and he didn't talk much. But now that Nate mentioned it, something about him seemed off. "He's acting different," Nate continued. "I mean, I don't remember him saying anything until this morning. Do you?" I didn't. But also, I couldn't remember when Carter had joined the search party. The howl started again around midday. We froze, listening as the eerie sound echoed through the trees. It wasn't far away this time. Worse, it didn't sound like one creature. It sounded like several, calling back and forth to each other. "We need to move," Nate said, his voice sharp. But before we could take another step, a figure appeared on the trail ahead of us. It was Jessie. She looked awful. Her clothes were torn, her face streaked with dirt, but she was smiling, like she hadn't just vanished into thin air. "Thank God," Nate said, rushing toward her. "Wait!" I hissed, grabbing his arm. Something about her wasn't right. She tilted her head, staring at us with wide and blinking eyes. "Why'd you leave me?" she asked. Her voice sounded normal, but her tone was flat, almost mechanical. "We didn't," Nate stammered. "You were—" "Why'd you leave me?" she interrupted. None of us moved. Jessie smiled wider, her teeth unnaturally white. "I'm fine now. Come here." That's when I noticed her hands. They were too long, her fingers unnaturally thin and ending in sharp black nails. "Run," I whispered. We bolted off the trail, crashing through the underbrush. The howls rose around us, louder and closer, and I swore I could hear laughter mixed in with the sounds. The 4 of us ran without looking back. I didn't even realize we'd lost someone until we stopped to catch our breath. It was Carter. He was gone. but none of us could agree on what happened to him. He was right behind me, Nate insisted, his face pale. No, he went left, someone else argued. My stomach churned. For a moment, I couldn't remember if Carter had even been with us when we started running. The woods felt darker now, the trees leaning in as if they were listening. We need to stick together, I said, though I wasn't sure who I was saying it to anymore. By the time night fell, there were only 3 of us left. We didn't talk about the others. We didn't talk about the fact that the footprints around us had multiplied. And we didn't talk about the campfire. We hadn't built it, but it was there anyway, crackling in the clearing just ahead. Nate wanted to avoid it, but the other guy, I think his name was Aaron, wasn't having it. We can't just sit in the dark, he said. He was right. So we sat by the fire, too scared to rest, too tired to run. That's when I noticed the stranger. He was sitting on the other side of the fire, just like before. You! Nate spat, standing up. Who the hell are you? The stranger tilted his head, his face hidden in shadow. Thomas, he said. Nate snapped. He lunged at the stranger, grabbing him by the collar and yanking him forward. That's when we saw his face. Or what was left of it. The stranger's skin was stretched too tight, his eyes bulging, his mouth hanging open in a grotesque grin. He didn't fight back as Nate shoved him to the ground. Didn't make a sound as his hat fell off, revealing hair that was thin and patchy, as if it had been burned. Then he started laughing. I don't remember running. All I remember is the sound of Nate screaming behind me and the stranger's laughter echoing in the trees. Aaron and I ran until we couldn't anymore, collapsing against a fallen log. Where's Nate? I asked, though I already knew the answer. Aaron didn't respond. We sat there in silence, the woods pressing in around us. The firelight had vanished, but I could still hear the crackle of flames somewhere in the distance. Eventually, Aaron turned to me. We should keep moving, he said. Something about his voice made me pause. It wasn't his voice. I stared at him, my heart pounding. What? I said, my throat dry. Aaron smiled. His teeth gleamed in the dim moonlight. I said we should keep moving. I stood up slowly, backing away. My mind raced, trying to remember. Had Aaron always been this tall? His voice always sounded so familiar. What's wrong? He asked, standing too. I bolted. I don't know how I made it out of the woods. I don't remember crossing the river or climbing the ridge that led back to town. All I know is that I'm the only one who made it. But sometimes, late at night, I'll catch my reflection in the window and feel like something's off. Like my eyes aren't quite right. And sometimes, when I look at my shadow, I swear, it moves just a little slower than I do.